1. The night of the first murder, a full moon sailed over Middle Georgia. Silver light and purple velvet shadows lent lawns, rooftops, and the broad, slick leaves of magnolias a luster of romance and mystery they didn't generally deserve. The very air pulsed with the glow. In Hopewell, Georgia, county seat of Little Hope County located midway between Augusta, Macon, and nowhere, residents slept fitfully. Yard dogs howled. A preacher dreamed strange dreams, and Amanda Kent let the wrong person in. I woke a little past midnight to hear our 3 coonhounds serenading the moon. Young Pat, an aspiring Pavarotti, sent notes throbbing into the night. Big Tom added a deeper bass, while old Queen Anne croaked along like an elderly alto who refuses to quit the choir. Just as I raised myself up on one elbow, our beagle Lulu chimed in on soprano. Lulu has a volume any opera singer would envy. That night she had a backup chorus, 6 pups caroling happily along with no notion they were being sent to new homes in a few days. I jabbed my sleeping husband in the ribs. "Wake up, Joe Riddley. Go hush those dogs before Maniac calls." Maniac and Hubert Spence were our nearest neighbors, up the pleasant dirt road Joe Riddley's great-granddaddy Yarbrough laid out, back when being half a mile out of town meant living in the country. Since our 2 places and the old Pickens place up near the highway are still the only houses on the road, nights are pretty quiet except for crickets, owls, and frogs. However, Maniac Spence, named Maynard by his parents but long ago rechristened by schoolmates, was, in his own words, sensitive and a light sleeper. Any minute now our phone would ring and I would hear, "Miss MacLaren, I hate to bother you so late, but could you ask Judge Yarbrough to do something about those dogs? I simply can't sleep with all that racket." Maniac was a champion whiner and stressed words like hairdressers stress highlighting for women past a certain age. The way he looked as a child, frail white limbs, wide gray eyes, pale yellow hair. I used to wonder if Maniac emphasized words to prove to the world that he was really there. Maybe that's why he came home from New York City with a long ponytail and 1 gold earring, too. He'd always hated Hopewell, so I hadn't been surprised when he headed north after high school to study history and stayed there. Until March, he hadn't come back but once, for his mother's funeral 5 years ago, when he was 21. Still, Maniac was a good son. We had to credit him for that. He gave up a good museum job and came right back when his daddy had a heart attack. He ran the appliance store until Hubert could get on his feet. Then after Hubert felt well enough to go down to the store each afternoon, Maniac still worked mornings. He even got permission to spend afternoons cleaning out our Little Hope County Historical Museum, which hadn't been kept up for 15 years, since the last curator died. He nearly drove us all crazy asking if we'd found any war relics in our fields, or insisting that things we used every day were antiques that he needed for displays. Maniac drove us crazy a lot of ways. Maybe he was just having a hard time adjusting to being back after so many years in New York City, but nothing seemed to suit him. He complained about the heat, complained about what he called the utter lack of culture in Hope County, complained about Southern food being bad for our health, even though folks around here tend to live a good long time. Most of all, he complained about how dusty our unpaved road got his new green Saturn. Joe Riddley lost his temper over that last one. "Son, this is a good road. Your relatives and mine have driven up and down it for over 100 years. You want a clean car? Hose it down each evening." After that, I often saw Maniac out rinsing off his car. With all the noise our dogs were making that full moon night, I just knew Maniac was reaching for his phone. Joe Riddley hadn't budged. I jabbed him again. "Go do something about those dogs."
"Good gracious, woman, you sound just like Maniac."
Joe Riddley climbed out of bed and plodded toward the door, moonlight stripes through our open blinds making him look more like a convict than a county magistrate. I heard him clomp downstairs. Then in a minute I heard him shout,
Quiet! Quiet now!"
from our back porch. If the dogs hadn't waked Maniac, that yelling would. However, Joe Riddley's hounds are so well trained, they stopped mid-howl. Lulu and the pups gave up in a few bars, and quiet reigned again except for crickets, a couple of frogs near our swimming pool, and thumps and bumps below. Joe Riddley's great-granddaddy built this house 5 years after General Sherman blazed by and created unprecedented prosperity for the Yarbrough Lumber Company. He built high ceilings, enormous rooms, and a wraparound porch in front, and along one side with a rounded curve and a little round pointed roof at the corner. When we took the house over from Joe Riddley's parents back when our boys were small, we screened in the side porch and that curve at the corner, remodeled the kitchen, updated the wiring and plumbing, and put in heat and air conditioning. Over the years, we'd repaired the tin roof, slicked things up inside occasionally with new paint and paper, and covered the outside with pale blue siding that didn't need painting. Otherwise, the house hadn't changed much. It was lovely and comfortable, but certainly not soundproof. I could hear every step as Joe Riddley fixed himself something to eat. Thump. He slammed the back door. Squeak! He opened the bread drawer. Thud! He closed the refrigerator. Smack! He got a plate from the cabinet and slammed that door. Joe Riddley never shut a door softly in his life. Scrape! He opened the drawer to get a knife. Creak! He was sitting down at the big round oak table his granddaddy built. Was I going to get no sleep at all? Still, now that he'd mentioned it, I was a tad hungry myself. I got up and put on a cotton robe. Living nearly a mile down a dirt road, I could go to the kitchen in my gown or even my birthday suit. But we seldom closed our blinds, and you never knew who might be outside doing what. That new doctor who bought the Pickens house, for instance, jogged up and down our road at all hours, and a fair share of Hopewell men hunted at night with a fine disregard for the Fish and Game Commission. I prided myself that I looked pretty good for a woman on the sunny side of 60. I didn't want word to get around that MacLaren Yarbrough was losing her figure. I found my spouse biting a hunk of the kind of sandwich that makes heart doctors see dollar signs.
What you doing up, little bit?
That's been his pet name for me since he was 6 and I was 4, and he blurted out one day, "You're the cutest little bit of a thing I ever did see." Since he was always 2 years older, and since I stopped growing at 5'3" while he climbed up past 6 feet, the name stuck. "Same thing you are, honey," I told him, raising my cholesterol level so I can sleep. Joe Riddley hadn't bothered to turn on a light. So much moonlight poured through our kitchen windows that moving around was like walking on the bottom of a silvery stream. I found a couple of cold chicken legs and a little potato salad Clorinda, our cook, had tucked in the fridge after dinner, and poured myself a cold glass of buttermilk to go with them. As I headed to the table, I thought fondly that Joe Riddley might be over 60, but he was still the handsomest man I knew. He was long and rangy, with high cheekbones, straight dark hair, and a permanent tan from his Cherokee great-grandmother. Even in his pajamas with his hair tousled, he had a kindly presence about him. An often convicted thief once confided to me, "Judge Yarbrough treats everybody with dignity, no matter what they done." I planted a kiss on the back of his neck on my way to my chair. Then we sat in the companionable silence of people who've been happily married for 45 years and have said everything that needs to be said for the moment. We had no idea what dreadful things were going on downtown. In a hot upstairs apartment, the Reverend Luke Blessed tossed and twisted in sweaty sheets. Luke Blessed, pronounced the old-fashioned way with 2 syllables, was our new assistant pastor, single and not quite 30. We adults voted to call him because of his answers to questions about faith and commitment. My 16-year-old granddaughter and her friends voted for his tight brown curls, navy blue eyes, and skill on an electric guitar. Poor Luke was hot because his landlady insisted, "There's always a breeze upstairs." Her house was on Oglethorpe Street, which runs right through the middle of Hopewell and along one side of the courthouse square. It has our biggest old houses, including 3 General Sherman's firebrands missed. Maynard's museum is in one. Luke lived in another, belonging to our congregation's oldest, wealthiest member. She created the small upstairs apartment because her children didn't like the notion of her living alone, but while she drove a Lincoln Continental and wore enough diamonds to feed most families for a year, she was well known for pinching pennies where others were concerned. Our pastor's search committee was foolish to take what she said about upstairs breezes for gospel truth. Luke moved into her apartment on a breezy April day. He never complained, but by May he'd bought 3 fans and opened his windows wide, trying to catch that reputed breeze. On the night of the August full moon, all he'd caught was sticky heat, streaming moonlight, and barking dogs. Anybody might have had fanciful dreams. Luke described his particular dream to the police the next week. I heard the tape. I was in a room I did not know. I could see a bed used like a couch over to one side and a lamp with a dark shade on a table beside it. There was a TV in one corner, I think. A tall man was standing in the doorway talking, although I couldn't hear a word he said. At first I thought he was talking to me, but then I realized I was invisible. He was talking to somebody sitting in a big blue chair between me and him. Because of the chair's high back, I didn't know if it was a man or a woman. All I could see was brown hair, dark brown. The man was tall, 6 feet maybe, with great biceps. He had blonde hair and wore a green outfit of some kind, matching pants and shirt. Maybe golf clothes. At first they were just talking. Slowly, though, even though he was still smiling, I began to get a feeling of menace, like he was threatening the other person. I got so nervous I wanted to get out of there. That's when I woke up. According to his testimony, Luke felt so disturbed by the dream that he couldn't stay in bed. Rising quietly so he wouldn't wake Miss Bessie downstairs, he went out to the old sleeping porch Miss Bessie had converted into a kitchen, got himself a glass of iced tea, and tiptoed to his living room up front. I thought about going out for a walk, he admitted. I wish now I had. Maybe I'd have heard something or been able to do something. But I didn't want to get dressed, so I figured I'd just get a head start on preparing for our young men's Bible study the next Tuesday evening. For half an hour I studied the book of Daniel, the chapter where Daniel interprets King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. I even decided that knowing we'd be studying that passage was probably what made me dream. After a while I relaxed enough to go on back to bed. He stopped and took a deep shuddering breath. As soon as I closed my eyes, though, that dream picked up right where I'd left off. The man across the room suddenly stepped toward the other person. I felt like something was terribly wrong. I tried to shout out a warning, but I couldn't make a sound. I saw him bring one hand from behind him, and he was holding something long. A walking cane, I think. Next thing I knew, he hauled off and hit whoever sat in the chair so hard I saw blood spurt up all over. The person collapsed forward, but I couldn't see if it was a man or a woman. All I could see was 2 hands raised in supplication, but he kept beating and beating. I tried to yell or run, but I was frozen. Finally, I woke up, crying. I knew I couldn't stay in bed any longer. I was afraid I'd keep dreaming. So I got up and spent the rest of the night reading and praying. It was too hot to sleep anyway. Hands raised in supplication? Assistant Police Chief Isaac James would ask Joe Riddley when he came by our office for a warrant to search the blessed apartment the following Wednesday. What kind of description is that? A preacher's kind, I told him tartly. Isaac James is a friendly, thorough bear of a man who played high school football with our son Walker. In the 10 or so years he's been coming into our office with warrants and such, Ike and I have become good friends. I make no bones about the fact that I think he's Hopemore's best police officer. He's so good, in fact, that even the racists in this town had sense enough to make him assistant police chief a few years back, in spite of his being black. However, while Ike and I generally see eye to eye on things, on that particular murder case—
Preacher or not, Miss MacLaren, Chief Muggins is certain he went next door and beat that poor Kent woman to death. A psychiatrist up in Augusta says all that folderol about a dream is just his way of confessing.
Ike shook his head and rubbed his eyes with one forearm to erase the memory.
I never saw such a mess in my life. Hope to never see the likes again. There wasn't much left but pulp.
Why had a shy, pretty, well-reared girl entertained somebody in her apartment that late at night in her nightgown? Luke's landlady summed up our collective opinion.
That girl was just asking for trouble, if you ask me.
If so, she got it. What was surprising, considering the ferocious nature of the crime, was that nobody seemed to have seen or heard a thing.